Mary Ann Evans, better known by her pen name George Eliot, is the author of 7 novels published during the Victorian period. Today, she is widely regarded as one of the most important of English novelists. Her greatest work is often considered to be Middlemarch, which has been described by both Martin Amis and Julian Barnes, amongst others, as the greatest novel in the English language. 3 aspects of her fiction are touched upon in this introductory video. George Eliot was born in Warwickshire on the 22nd of November 1819. When she was 4 months old, she moved with her father, Robert Evans, a builder, carpenter and estate manager, her mother, Christiana, and her 2 older siblings to Griff, an attractive, red-brick, ivy-covered house on the Arbury estate. This was to be the future novelist's home for the first 21 years of her life. As a little girl, she was taken for occasional outings in her father's gig, and looked upon broad meadows with their long lines of willows marking the watercourses, cornfields divided by straggling hedgerows, remote hamlets, and, at intervals, squires' mansions, embowered with patrician trees. Although the region was not unblemished by the coal dust of manufacture, it was primarily agricultural, and an 18th century calm lingered pleasantly. When, aged 37, George Eliot began to publish her first short stories, which when collected would become scenes of clerical life, it was her formative years in the countryside that provided her material. To a large extent, the plots are reproductions of remembered incidents, and the stories contain a number of approximate portraits of rustic Midlanders. Some of the emergent novelist's former neighbours, on hearing the stories and recognising themselves, supposed that the author was still among their number. The publication 2 years later of George Eliot's first novel, Adam Bede, which was similarly furnished with local details and suffused with a ruddy bucolic glow, led to the entrenchment of this suspicion. A comic episode is recorded in which one of the novelist's former neighbours wrote to her, asking if she had read the book and informing her that the person calling himself George Eliot was really none other than old Mr. Liggins, who had apparently given the fruits of his labour to his publisher for free. The titular character of Adam Bede, an honest, hard-working, practically and morally intelligent carpenter, whom the reader is made aware that he is meant to admire, is closely based upon the writer's father. But for many readers, the hero of this first novelistic performance is eclipsed by the character who in some respects resembled George Eliot's mother. Mrs. Poyser, who lives with her family at the dairy farm rented from the squire, is both artlessly affectionate and readily equipped with rustic wit. When the squire hints that he might give the dairy farm to a different tenant, Mrs. Poyser replies by cataloguing the various faults of the property, including, quote, "rats and mice gnawing every bit of cheese and running over our heads as we lie in bed till we expect them to eat us up alive." As in the semi-autobiographical first part of George Eliot's next novel, The Mill on the Floss, and also in her third novel, Silas Marner, the reader has an impression of the fundamental soundness at the core of rustic society. There is a beauty not just in individuals alone, but in the whole, quiet, humdrum order of existence of the lower strata. George Eliot writes with a loving memory. She is perfectly aware of the darker sides of the past, though she does not insist upon them. Pinning down her approach, the significant word is charm. But this characteristic of her early work was not to remain at the centre of her literary project. Before George Eliot gained fame and fortune as a writer in her late 30s, she was possessed of what can perhaps best be described as an undirected soul hunger, a profound emotional and intellectual need to locate a sphere of activity which would enable personal fulfillment. During her teenage years, she later admitted to having despaired of ever being able to accomplish anything of value. There was little indication at this early stage of her development that her ethical rootlessness would lead her towards novel writing. When she was aged 19, she told her aunt that the standard works, such as Scott, Cervantes, and Shakespeare, are to be read in order merely to understand common allusions. The problem was one of evil influences. When one reads Shakespeare, one has to be careful, in the young George Eliot's words, quote, "to suck nothing but honey from his pages." Her soul hunger took on a modified shape in her early 20s, as the austere evangelicalism which had inspired her distrust of fiction gave way to religious doubt. But her reconstructed, undogmatic faith, born of a desire to hold together human affection and the truths of science, was hardly more amenable to an appreciation, and far less to the production, of literature. Although aged 27, she professed to reading the great French novelist George Sand. with delight. This was really more of a tolerant skepticism. After undertaking 2 major projects of translation and a stint working all hours as a de facto editor of the Westminster Review, she was to experience the breakthrough event. George Henry Lewes, a journalist and literary celebrity who wrote on a range of topics, repelled his future partner when they first met on account of his apparent levity. But in his own words, he soon, quote, quite won her liking in spite of herself. Whilst marriage was impossible because Lewes was unable to divorce his wife, the 2 lovers endured and to a large extent overcame the censure of society, forging a successful and deeply loving union together. It was primarily on the strength of her essays, which convinced Lewes of her genius, that he urged her to try her hand at fiction. George Eliot had finally found her métier. The search for a suitably noble and elevated vocation, which had been a preoccupation since girlhood, first enters into George Eliot's fictive world in The Mill on the Floss. The character of Maggie Tulliver bears a close resemblance to her creator. When we hear that Maggie was thirsty for all knowledge, with an ear straining after dreamy music that died away and would not come near to her, with a blind, unconscious yearning for something that would link together the wonderful impressions of this mysterious life and give her soul a sense of home in it, we know that we are in direct correspondence with the author. The reader re-encounters this theme in George Eliot's 4th novel, Romola, a closely researched historical fiction set in late 15th century Florence. Romola, the heroine, is made up of the familiar elements: intellectual power, emancipation, inherent piety, and the desire for exaltations. The treatment of the theme, however, has a heavier feel. The charm of The Mill on the Floss has been superseded by a denser prose of fine-spun psychological and ethical analysis. The reader might consider that Romola is somehow less real than Maggie Tulliver. Romola, as Henry James puts it, is a product not so much of observation, but rather of George Eliot's moral consciousness. Skipping over her 5th novel, Felix Holt, which is her least interesting, the preface to her 6th novel, Middlemarch, prepares us for another presentation of the author's favourite concern. Saint Teresa, the reader's memory is refreshed, had a passionate, ideal nature which demanded an epic life. Saint Teresa found her purpose in the reform of a religious order, but many women like Saint Teresa have been born since, George Eliot says, only to find that the opportunities to lead an epic life are severely restricted. This is the context in which we are to situate one of the principal characters of the novel, Dorothea Brooke. For a long while she had been oppressed by the indefiniteness which had hung in her mind like a thick summer haze over all her desire to make her life greatly effective. What could she do? What ought she to do? George Eliot's last novel, Daniel Deronda, provides the final variation on the theme of searching for a noble vocation. The eponymous hero, who is established as a paragon of virtue, yearns after a grand duty, and he eventually finds it by uncovering the truth of his ancestry. It remains to be asked, why did George Eliot come to think that writing novels would provide her with the higher life which she had long wished for? This question points to the way in which she thought her books functioned. Shortly after the publication of Adam Bede, she gave an explicit statement of her theory. If art does not enlarge men's sympathies, it does nothing morally. The only effect I ardently long to produce by my writings is that those who read them should be better able to imagine and to feel the pains and the joys of those who differ from themselves in everything but the broad fact of being struggling, erring human creatures. Reading is, of course, an active process, and any given reader might consciously or unconsciously resist the author's intentions. However, many of George Eliot's readers did seem to engage with her novels as she hoped. For instance, Mrs. Carlyle said after reading Adam Bede that she felt herself in, quote, charity with the whole human race. Incidentally, her husband Thomas Carlyle, the hero-worshipping staunch anti-Semite, could not be persuaded to read the book. One of the more memorable objects of our sympathy is Dr. Casaubon, the desiccated scholar who appears in Middlemarch. Dr. Casaubon has spent a lifetime carrying out research and gathering materials for his great work, The Key to All Mythologies. But Dr. Casaubon's efforts are in vain, in part because he is unaware of the work being done by his German counterparts. Although George Eliot allows the reader an occasional chuckle at Dr. Casaubon's expense, the pathos of his situation is clearly communicated. If a moral influence is exerted on the reader, we can perhaps say, along with the Victorian man of letters Leslie Stephen, that this is due in the last resort to the personality of the novelist. From reading George Eliot's novels, we are influenced in the same way as by an intimacy with George Eliot herself. And we know that the writer with whom we have been in contact had a tolerant spirit, a wide intellectual culture, a keen awareness of noble aspirations, and a sincere desire to be of use to others.